Ruth Jackson, an elderly woman living alone, was sitting before a dying fire when she flinched at the sound of a child crying out in the cold mist. She steps out onto the porch where the flickering lamplight reveals an exhausted man clutching two shivering newborn babies in his arms, desperately begging for a place to shelter. She offered them nothing more than a bed of straw in her old shed, until a hoarse, fragile cough made her hesitate. She opened her door and brought them inside to warm and care for them, never knowing that this small act of kindness would drag a buried past back into the light and soon change the rest of her life forever. Before we dive in this story, let us know where you watching from. We love to hear your thought. Cedar Hollow sat far enough into the Montana hills that the road stopped pretending it knew where it was going. Past the last bend there were no signs, no neighbors close enough to wave at, no reason for anyone to pass through unless they meant to disappear for a while. Ruth Jackson liked it that way. She had lived on the Cedar Hollow Ranch for over 20 years, long enough for the silence to stop feeling like an absence and start feeling like a rule. Ruth was nearly 70, black and alone in a way that didn't announce itself. She woke before sunrise every morning, not because she needed to, but because her body had learned that stillness after dawn was dangerous. She washed her face with cold water, folded her blanket the same way every time, and sat at the small kitchen table with a single cup of coffee she never sweetened. The house was old, but it was clean, too clean. Every surface wiped, every tool returned to its place, every chair pushed in just enough to say someone cared. People who visited once years ago said it felt like a house holding its breath. No one in town was cruel to Ruth. They waved, they nodded, they spoke politely when spoken to. But no one stayed long. She was the woman who never remarried. The woman whose son had died in a mining accident decades back. The woman who kept her land when others sold and moved closer to town. Folks respected her space the same way they respected a closed door from a distance. Ruth's days followed a strict rhythm. Feed the chickens, check the fences, mend what the winter had pulled loose, eat at noon whether she was hungry or not, rest her back for exactly 30 minutes in the afternoon, supper at 6, dishes washed immediately, lights out by 9. It was a system built to keep the hours from drifting too far into places she didn't want to revisit. In the back bedroom, beneath a loose floorboard under the dresser, Ruth kept a small wooden box no one else had ever seen. It was locked. The key lived on a string around her neck, hidden beneath her shirt. On nights when sleep wouldn't come, when the wind pressed too hard against the walls or the coyotes cried too close, she would sit on the edge of the bed, slide the box out, unlock it, and lift a single small object into her palm. She never lingered. She never cried. She would hold it just long enough for her breath to steady, then lock the box away again like she was returning something borrowed. There were things Ruth had been before Cedar Hollow, but the town didn't remember them. Once a long time ago, she had been a midwife. A good one. She had delivered babies in cramped trailers and drafty farmhouses, hands steady even when the fathers panicked and the mothers screamed. She knew how to listen to a body when it couldn't speak, but time erased that version of her. New doctors came, new clinics opened, people forgot who had helped them survive the worst nights of their lives. Ruth never reminded them. That evening the wind came earlier than usual. It slid down from the hills with a sharp edge, rattling the loose boards on the porch and setting the chickens on edge before the sun had fully dipped. Ruth finished her supper in silence, rinsed her plate, and dried it immediately. She was halfway through checking the back latch when she heard it. A sound. Not loud, not close, but wrong. She froze, hand still on the doorframe, listening. The wind shifted, then it came again. A thin sound, uneven, almost swallowed by the air. Ruth frowned, her chest tightening without her permission. She told herself it was nothing. An animal, maybe. A fox caught in wire. But the sound came again, closer now, and this time she recognized the rhythm. Crying. Ruth's jaw set. She stayed where she was, counting slowly in her head, like she used to when a labor went sideways. 1, 2, 3. The crying broke, then returned, sharper, strained. She crossed the kitchen, lifted the lantern from its hook, and stepped onto the porch. The night was colder than it had any right to be. Fog clung low to the ground, turning the yard into something unreal, the shapes of the barn and fence blurred and uncertain. The sound came from near the road. Ruth took one step, then another, the lantern casting a weak circle of light ahead of her. That was when she saw him. A man stood just beyond the gate, tall but slumped, his coat too thin for the cold. He held two bundled shapes against his chest, his arms shaking from the effort. When the lantern light hit his face, Ruth saw exhaustion carved deep into his features, eyes red, jaw clenched like he was holding himself together by force alone. One of the bundles let out a wet, hoarse cry that cut straight through her. "I'm sorry," the man said quickly, voice low, respectful, already braced for refusal. "Ma'am, I don't mean any trouble. I need somewhere out of the wind, just for the night. The barn, maybe. I won't come inside." Ruth didn't answer right away. She took him in with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read danger fast. No horse, no wagon, mud on his boots but not blood. The babies, because now it was clear they were babies, were wrapped tight but still shivering, their cries uneven, tired. "You can sleep in the shed," Ruth said finally, her voice flat, controlled. "There's straw. Take the corner farthest from the door. Leave by morning." Relief crossed his face so fast it almost hurt to look at. "Thank you," he said, bowing his head slightly. "I won't forget this." She watched him move toward the shed, his steps slow, careful, like every movement cost him something. The crying didn't stop. It followed him into the fog, thin and broken, until the night swallowed it whole. Ruth shut the door and locked it. She leaned her back against the wood and closed her eyes for a moment longer than she meant to. Her heart was beating harder than it should have been. She told herself she'd done enough. She told herself that was where it ended. It didn't. Sleep didn't come. The wind rose, pressing against the house in uneven gusts. Ruth turned from side to side, her mind counting the seconds between sounds. Somewhere outside, one of the babies began to cry again, louder now, strained. Another cry joined it, weaker but persistent. Ruth sat up in bed, her hands gripping the edge of the mattress. "Damn it," she muttered softly. She tried to ignore it. She told herself the man was their father, that he knew what to do, that she had done her part. But the crying dragged at her nerves, pulled memories loose she had buried deep and sealed tight. Her chest ached in a way she hadn't felt in years. Ruth swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood. She reached beneath the dresser, slid the wooden box free, unlocked it with shaking fingers, and lifted the small object inside. She didn't look at it long. Just long enough to steady her breath. From outside, one baby let out a rough coughing cry that ended in a thin wail. Ruth's eyes snapped open. She set the object back in the box, locked it, and pushed it out of sight. "Lord help me," she whispered, already pulling on her coat. As she stepped toward the door, a thought flickered through her mind, uninvited and sharp as frost, a memory, half-formed. She shook her head, as if she could dislodge it. "Long time ago," she murmured to no one. "Just once." She paused, her hand on the latch, listening to the crying cut through the night again, and added quietly, almost without realizing she'd said it at all, "I used to watch a baby who cried like that." Then Ruth Jackson opened the door, and stepped back into the cold, unaware that the life she had built around staying alone had just cracked open, and something she thought she'd lost forever was already finding its way home. The door closed behind Ruth, but the sound of the crying stayed with her, slipping through the walls like cold air finding cracks she didn't know were there. She stepped off the porch with the lantern held low, the light wobbling with each careful step toward the shed, and for a brief second she wondered when she'd started answering sounds she'd sworn she would ignore. The wind carried the baby's cries in uneven bursts now, one sharper than the other, and that difference alone made her stomach tighten because experience told her uneven was never good. The shed door creaked when she pushed it open. Inside, the man sat hunched against the far wall, his coat wrapped around the two bundles like it was the only thing keeping them alive. His head snapped up when he saw her, panic flashing across his face before he caught himself. "I'm sorry," he said immediately, words tumbling over each other. "They're just fussy, I'll get them quiet. I promise." Ruth didn't answer. She stood there, lantern light cutting through the dim, and watched. One baby cried in ragged gasps, the sound dry, wrong. The other whimpered softer but wouldn't stop. The man rocked, tried shushing, tried bouncing, tried humming under his breath, but his hands shook with exhaustion and nothing worked. Ruth's jaw clenched. "How long they been like this?" she asked. He hesitated, eyes flicking down. "Since before dark. We walked most of the day. I thought once they were still." His voice trailed off. She stepped closer despite herself. The crying scraped at her nerves, dragged old instincts to the surface like hooks. "That one's hoarse," she said, nodding at the baby with the harsher cry. The man nodded quickly. Yes, ma'am. Been coughing some too. Something twisted in Ruth's chest. She straightened, forcing her voice back into place. They're staying out here, she said. I said the shed. That hasn't changed. Relief and confusion crossed his face at the same time. Thank you, he said again, softer now. She turned to leave, but the crying followed her, louder, sharper, until it felt like it was pushing her from behind. Back inside the house, Ruth shut the door harder than she meant to and leaned against it, her breath shallow. She told herself she'd done enough. She told herself she was not responsible for every broken thing that crossed her land. She sat at the kitchen table and stared at the clock. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The crying didn't stop. It shifted, rose, broke, returned, the rhythm wrong in a way she couldn't ignore. Ruth pressed her palms flat against the table, counting the grain in the wood. She knew that cry. She hated that she knew it. Outside, the man paced the length of the shed, boots crunching softly on straw. He whispered apologies to the babies like saying them enough times might turn them into sleep. He told himself he had to get through the night, just the night, and then he'd move on. He didn't look toward the house again. He didn't want to see the door stay shut. Back in the kitchen, Ruth stood abruptly. She crossed the room, stopped, then crossed it again like a caged animal. You are not doing this, she muttered to herself, but her feet were already carrying her to the door. She grabbed a blanket, then another, and a tin cup she filled with warm water because her hands remembered what to do, even when her mind fought it. When she opened the shed door the second time, the man startled. Ma'am, you don't have to. Be quiet, Ruth snapped sharper than she intended. She knelt without asking, her movements brisk, controlled. She didn't take the babies yet. She listened. She leaned in close, lantern forgotten. The hoarse cry rasped again, and her heart dropped. He's breathing shallow, she said, more to herself than to the man. You been feeding him water? Yes, ma'am, he said quickly. Just a little. I was afraid. She cut him a look. Not like that. You'll choke him. The man froze. Ruth reached out before she could stop herself and adjusted the baby's position, firm but careful. The crying hitched, then eased just a fraction. The man stared at her hands like they were performing some kind of quiet miracle. I didn't say you could bring them inside, Ruth said, standing abruptly as if catching herself. This is just so they don't freeze. Of course, he said, nodding too fast. Of course. She left again, heart pounding, anger bubbling under her ribs because she knew she was already too far in. Back in the house, she tried to sit. She tried to drink her coffee. It had gone cold. She set it down untouched. Miles away, in a town Ruth hadn't visited in months, a letter slid across a worn wooden desk and came to rest beneath the hand of a man just past 60. He frowned as he read it, the lines in his face deepening. He hadn't expected news like this to resurface. He folded the paper slowly, set it aside, and stared at nothing for a long moment, already weighing what it might cost him to ignore it. At Cedar Hollow, the crying spiked again, sharp enough that Ruth flinched. That was it. She moved faster this time, throwing open the door and crossing the yard without the lantern. The cold bit into her bones, but she barely noticed. She pushed into the shed and held out her arms. Give me the one that's coughing, she said. The man didn't hesitate. He placed the baby in her arms with a care that made her throat tighten. The baby cried once more, then stilled just a little against her chest. Ruth's body adjusted instinctively, rocking without thought. She caught herself and stiffened, anger flashing. I'm not keeping them, she said aloud, as if the night needed to hear it. I know, the man said quietly. She carried the baby toward the house before she realized what she was doing. She stopped at the door, her hand on the latch, the weight of the small body warm and fragile against her. Inside, the fire crackled softly. Outside, the other baby cried harder now, as if